During the victory celebrations at the end of the Second World War, Comrade Stalin proposed a toast to the Russian nation, the most outstanding nation of all the Soviet nations and the leading force of the Soviet Union. This remark seemed at odds with the Soviet self-image of having no leading nation. And while the speech was largely ignored in the West, some commentators inside the Soviet Union voiced their confusion. Initially, Russian nationalism was suppressed when the Bolsheviks took power. It was associated with the White Army, Tsarist oppression, and imperialism. All that the Bolsheviks opposed. However, during the 1930s, Soviet nationalities policy shifted toward a revival of the Russian nation as the leading nation of the empire. Starting in the late 1930s, supranational Soviet propaganda and Russocentrism coexisted in an awkward tension that persisted until the end of the Soviet Union. This shift was preceded by successive waves of ethnic deportations. The ethnic cleansing campaigns were mainly directed against non-Russian nationalities, but they were not originally intended to benefit Russians. In a few cases, even small groups of Russians were deported. However, the Bolsheviks' growing and at times self-fulfilling mistrust of non-Russian nationalities helped to strengthen the Russian core of the empire and to reorient the nationalities policy. In 1937, 8 years before Stalin's toast, the British adventurer Fitzroy MacLean took up a post at the British Embassy in Moscow. But as soon as he arrived, he took leave with a private ambition: to travel through Central Asia and visit the legendary cities of Samarkand, Tashkent, and Bukhara. Central Asia was the hub of the Silk Road, a mythical and exotic region that captured the imagination of many Europeans. On his first attempt, he traveled south to Baku and tried to cross the Caspian Sea. However, at the Lenchrin harbor, he could not find a ship that would take him because all of them were occupied by Turco-Tatar peasants who were forcibly deported to Central Asia. Unable to find a ship, he tried traveling further south on horseback, where he was almost shot by secret police border troops. When he revealed himself as a British diplomat and told the border troops that the consequences of shooting him would be quite unpleasant for them, they replied that they would probably be more unpleasant for him, and then sent him back to Moscow. On a second attempt to reach Soviet Central Asia, he went east on the Trans-Siberian Railway to Novosibirsk and then tried to head back west toward Turkestan. During a temporary stop in Barnaul, he witnessed another large-scale deportation. Koreans were removed from the Primorsky Krai and sent to Central Asia. It may seem like a striking coincidence that MacLean encountered large deportations wherever he traveled in the Soviet Union. Yet many memoirs from the period report similar scenes. Only relatively recently have historians been able to confirm most of the ethnic deportations recorded by visitors and locals. Today we know that in the 1930s and 40s, the Soviet state ethnically cleansed Poles, Ukrainians, Belarusians, Lithuanians, Finns, Crimean Tatars, Koreans, Greeks, Armenians, Bulgarians, Meskhetian Turks, Kurds, Chemshin, and other nationalities. In most cases, nationalities living along the borderlands were deported deeper into the interior of the country. But how did this come about? Yes, ethnic cleansing was widespread in the 20th century, and the Soviet Union was far from the only state to carry out mass deportations. But the Bolsheviks were not an ultra-nationalist party seeking to build an ethnically homogeneous nation-state. In this video, I want to explore how and why the Soviet campaigns of ethnic cleansing unfolded in the 1930s and how the Russification of the empire took shape. I thereby rely primarily on the works of the historian Terry Martin. It is a common misconception that Lenin supported nationalism while Stalin opposed it. Lenin's stance on nationalism was pragmatic and strategic. Broadly speaking, he distinguished between the progressive nationalism of oppressed peoples, who deserved the right to self-determination, and the regressive nationalism of oppressors, which reinforced imperialism. Lenin's support for progressive nationalism was tactical, a temporary concession intended to last only until nationalism naturally exhausted itself under socialism. At the same time, the fight against so-called bourgeois nationalism aimed to prevent the emergence of a nationalism that could be mobilized against the unitary rule of the party. It was the simultaneous pursuit of nation building and nation dismantling, based on the same set of principles. This perspective shaped the Soviet nationalities policy known as Korenisatsiia. In practice, the policy led to the creation of Soviet republics and national districts, the restriction of Russian nationalism, and the implementation of affirmative actions for non-Russian nationalities. Lenin and Stalin broadly agreed on the Soviet nationalities policy, differing only on practical questions concerning the structure of the future Soviet Union and on some minor points. In fact, it was Stalin who defended the policy after Lenin's death against many skeptical Bolsheviks. However, starting in the late 1920s, several developments convinced Stalin that the stability of the empire required a reform of the nationalities policy. This reform was accompanied by massive campaigns of terror and ethnic cleansing. In the years following the Civil War, there were small-scale deportations of Russian settlers in the East as a goodwill gesture toward local populations, while punitive deportations also took place, such as the expulsion of anti-Bolshevik Cossacks from the short-lived mountain ASSR in 1920. Initially, the Bolsheviks regarded these expulsions as one-time measures and not something they had to repeat. However, during and after the collectivization of agriculture, ethnic cleansing campaigns expanded dramatically. Millions were deported, hundreds of thousands were ethnically cleansed, and whole nationalities were categorized as enemy nations. The Soviet deportations were carried out with a high degree of planning and efficiency by well-trained state security forces and were generally not accompanied by overt intentional mass murder. The mass executions took place separately during the terror waves. But as Terry Martin writes, the ethnic deportations always included many arrests that resulted in incarceration in high-mortality prison camps. Moreover, the deportations were carried out incredibly swiftly, which ensured that large numbers of individuals would die of exposure, starvation, and disease both during and after the deportations. Furthermore, the stigmatization made certain nationalities primary targets during the terror campaigns. The first large-scale deportations of the 1930s were primarily class-based, targeting the so-called kulaks, an ambiguous category without clear definition that ultimately came to include any peasant who resisted collectivization. Between 1930 and 1931, some 1.8 million people were deported as kulaks. Many were subjected to forced labor or resettled in remote parts of Siberia to help colonize those regions. Soon afterward, however, the Bolsheviks shifted from class-based deportations to ethnicity-based deportations. These later deportations were driven by considerations of regime security. Whole nations were indiscriminately branded unreliable. Furthermore, whenever groups were deported, the Bolsheviks feared that the remaining family members, clans, or fellow nationals would harbor resentment against the regime, which triggered further waves of deportations. In the second half of the 1930s, the situation escalated further. A purge of political refugees within the Soviet Union was launched. The secret NKVD decree number 00447 targeted kulaks, alleged criminals, and other anti-Soviet elements, resulting in the conviction of around 750,000 people, 380,000 of whom were executed. A month later, decree number 00485 was issued, primarily targeting Poles in the Soviet Union. It led to the execution of at least 100,000 individuals and marked the beginning of a broader nationalities terror that affected many other groups. The turn to ethnicity-based deportations was connected to the reform of Korenisatsiia and the subsequent Russification of the empire. The Politburo decree of December 1932 marked a turning point in Soviet nationalities policy and the beginning of large-scale deportations. However, it did not signal a complete reversal. While hundreds of thousands were deported on the basis of their ethnicity, softline institutions continued to discourage assimilation and supported the preservation of local cultures. Many affirmative action measures remained in place, yet the Bolsheviks gradually shifted from publicly celebrating these policies to quietly maintaining the remnants of Korenisatsiia. The Bolsheviks responded to growing opposition within the empire by intensifying the simultaneous aims of their nationalities policy. For example, in 1930, the number of national institutions for Germans and Poles increased. At the same time, growing numbers of Germans and Poles were deported on the basis of their ethnicity. Stalin's shift in nationalities policy and the implementation of Russification were not part of any pre-planned strategy. Rather, they arose from practical concerns that developed over time. They were a response to a range of problems. The Bolsheviks wrestled with fears of invasion, growing distrust of the borderlands, resistance to collectivization, the grain requisition crisis and the following famine, discontent with the paternalistic character of the Bolsheviks' revolution from above, and resentment among Russian communists over the suppression of Russian culture. The suppression of Russian nationalism peaked during the Cultural Revolution. From that moment onwards, however, Russian culture began to be rehabilitated. The Bolshevik leadership, increasingly distrustful of the borderlands, gradually shifted its reliance more heavily toward the Russian core of the empire. During the Great Terror of 1937 and 38, the RSFSR was consolidated as the center of Russian dominance, both culturally and politically. The terror played a key role in strengthening the influence of the Russian core over the Soviet Union as a whole, effectively marking the end of the more inclusive and pluralistic nationalities policy that had characterized the regime's earlier years. One example of Russification is the shift in policy toward the Russian language and the Cyrillic alphabet. In the 1920s, the Russian alphabet had been denounced as a symbol of oppression. The Latinization of Eastern languages, that were mostly driven by local elites, had three key effects. It strengthened nationalism, often in the form of pan-Turkism, directly challenged Russian cultural influence, and served to counter the spread of Islam. This Latinization movement reached its peak in 1932, but was quietly abandoned in the following years, as the Bolsheviks turned their focus toward promoting the Cyrillic alphabet. A notable example of this change took place in Moldova, where Romanian was the spoken language, which was already Latinized in the 19th century. However, after the failure of the Puigdemont principle, which sought to attract Romanians to the Moldovan ASSR, the Bolsheviks abandoned the idea that Romanians could be drawn to the Soviet Union that easily. In response, they implemented a more defensive foreign policy. This involved replacing the Latin alphabet with Cyrillic as part of an effort to integrate Moldova more closely into the Soviet Union. Furthermore, during the Nationalities terror of 1933, Ukrainian and Belarusian linguists became primary targets. A new charge of linguistic sabotage emerged, with Ukrainian linguists in particular accused of undermining the translation of the Marxist, Leninist, Stalinist classics. This campaign was part of a broader effort to suppress any forms of regional or national cultural autonomy perceived as challenging the centralization of Soviet power. From October to December 1937, the Politburo, Orgbureau, and a Central Committee plenum passed a series of resolutions that tightened the ideological supervision of the translation of Marxist-Leninist classics, made the Russian language a mandatory subject in all schools, liquidated national districts and village soviets, liquidated all non-Russian schools in the Russian regions of the RSFSR, and increased the number of Russian newspapers in Ukraine. Dozens of languages were shifted to the Cyrillic alphabet. One example of the renewed dominance of the Russian language can be seen in an article from the Uchelskaya Gazeta from 1938. The great and mighty Russian language, the language of Lenin and Stalin, Pushkin and Gorky, Tolstoy and Belinsky, is profoundly dear to all citizens of the USSR and is studied with love by children and adults, which shows the exclusive interest of all nationalities to the study of the language of the great Russian people, first among equals in the fraternal family of the peoples of the USSR. The article continues, Trotskyist Bukharinites and bourgeois nationalist agents of fascism attempted to separate the fraternal peoples from the great culture of the Russian people, denied non-Russian students texts and teaching aids to study Russian. The article highlights the shift in policy. The suppression of Russian national identity, which had been a key feature of earlier Soviet policies, was now framed as counter-revolutionary. By 1938, then, a purposeful, comprehensive, and carefully targeted institutional Russification of the RSFSR had been set into motion. This process led to the division of the Soviet Union into a central Russian core and a non-Russian national periphery. Gradual changes in the nationalities policy were initiated in 1932 and solidified during the Great Terror of 1937 and 38. This period is often referred to as the Great Retreat, a term coined by the historian Nicholas Timashev in 1946. It described the abandonment of utopian social and cultural ideals in favor of more traditional values. Policies associated with the Great Retreat included the rejection of progressive teaching methods, the prohibition of abortion, the introduction of new barriers to divorce, and the imposition of socialist realism as the dominant form of art. However, what is sometimes overlooked is that the core socialist goals were not abandoned. The fundamental Marxist-Leninist objectives, collectivization, industrialization, nationalization of the means of production, the abolition of the market, and the establishment of political dictatorship, remained intact. What changed was the cultural and social superstructure. Crucially, the most significant aspect of the Great Retreat, and, as Terry Martin argues, its precondition, was the rehabilitation of the Russian nation. The Stalinist Russification was limited and did not amount to a revival of the Russian Empire. Overt Russian nationalism that was opposed to the Communist Party was still censored. However, all national Soviets, districts and kolkhozes were abolished. Diaspora nations were categorized as enemy nations, the Russian language became mandatory in all Soviet schools, the Latinization campaign was reversed, and the Russian culture gained a unifying role. Moreover, the Soviet republics were not allowed to regulate the migration of Russian workers into non-Russian republics. The Soviet state ensured that deported populations were replaced with carefully chosen settlers. Red Army veterans were regarded as ideal, since they were considered politically reliable, and in the border regions, entire farming communities of veterans replaced the deported nationalities. At the same time, growing numbers of Russians migrated from the RSFSR into the non-Russian republics. Initially, this influx was not intended as a deliberate policy of Russification. Russians, by far the largest nationality and the best represented among skilled workers, were dispatched mainly because many non-Russian regions urgently required qualified labor, and Stalin insisted that the rapid transformation of the state could not wait for a large local workforce to develop. It is still debated among historians to which extent this migration turned into an instrument of deliberate Russification. Stalin branded his reformed nationalities policy the friendship of the peoples. When the new Soviet constitution was introduced in 1936, it was also declared that socialism had been achieved in the Soviet Union. However, Stalin argued that with the consolidation of socialism, nation-states would not disappear, but would instead be transformed into socialist nations. Only after the worldwide triumph of communism will nations dissolve. With the enactment of the new Soviet constitution, 5 new Soviet republics and 5 autonomous republics were created. The formation of these new nation-states was celebrated as a generous act of Soviet power. The term socialist nation-state entered the discourse to distinguish it from the bourgeois nation-state. The socialist nations had achieved stateness through the actions of the Soviet regime and were bound together with the other socialist nations by the so-called friendship of the peoples. This new order brought with it a new dynamic among the Soviet nations. The Russian nation became the central and dominant nation to which all the other nations were expected to be grateful. This also reshaped the interpretation of the past. While in the early years of the Soviet Union, Tsarist Russia had been portrayed as a brutal colonizer of the East, Soviet history books now followed Stalin's lesser evil theory. According to this theory, the Russian annexation of territories in the East and South in the 19th century had been beneficial for these populations, as it protected them from potential colonization by France or Britain. The exoticization of national cultures, which had been criticized during the early stages of Korenisatsiia, was now fervently celebrated. The focus shifted to folkloric and exotic elements of national cultures, and a cliched, essentialized rhetoric of national character came to dominate. All nations were expected to repeatedly express their gratitude to Stalin, and non-Russians were encouraged to show brotherly appreciation to the Russians for their guidance. Russians were now cast as the elder brother of all socialist nations, while Stalin himself assumed the role of the All-Father. Soviet propaganda increasingly portrayed Stalin as the loving father of the Soviet Union, with the various Soviet nations as his children. Representatives from all nationalities were invited to Moscow, where they presented him with gifts and expressed their gratitude, often wearing traditional national dress. One of the most famous photographs of Stalin was taken in this context. It shows him holding a Buryat Mongol girl named Engelsina Markizova, who had brought him flowers. Myriads of similar images were distributed, often bearing the caption, "Thank you, Stalin, for our happy childhood." Engelsina Markizova's father, who had named her after Friedrich Engels, was executed during the Great Purge in 1938. Her mother was deported to Kazakhstan, where she later died under unclear circumstances. For the remainder of Stalin's rule, Engelsina was stigmatized as a child of an enemy of the people. The Friendship of the Peoples was designed not only to unify the various nationalities within the Soviet Union, but also to include socialist nations beyond its borders. After World War II, the Eastern European satellite states were integrated into the Friendship of the Peoples. Later, the provision of energy became one of the pillars of this project, with oil and gas pipelines bearing names such as Brotherhood and Friendship, which leads us to a future video on the political implications of the Soviet energy infrastructure.